Hello, good morning, everyone. This is Gloria Zans. I'm the technology guru for the Innovation Learning Network. We are excited to bring you this morning's Exponential Technology Tuesday, Beyond Machines, Robots, our companion, our caregiver, and our friend. When was the last time you thought about a robot as a companion or a caregiver or a friend? Probably never. That's because robots are generally associated with the words of cold, hard, emotionless. However, in recent years, innovators have begun to challenge that notion by creating engaging robots that are social, interactive, and friendly. And they are starting to show up in our homes, on our countertops, and some have even been adopted as family members. So this morning, the Innovation Learning Network, in collaboration with GNHIC, curated a panel of 3 disruptors with deep knowledge of robotics. So let me go ahead and introduce the panel this morning. We're going to have Mohr, VP of Strategy at Intuitive Surgical, kick us off and give us context to robotics use in healthcare. Then followed up by Jennifer Cunha, who is the Innovation Catalyst and Improvement Advisor at Kaiser Permanente, to talk about use cases in healthcare. And we will wrap up with an emerging tech innovator featuring Catalia Health, and Charles Wu, who is the Director of Product Management at Catalia Health, will be taking us and showing us the amazing product that they have. But first, before we hand things over to Catherine to kick us off this morning, we have a few housekeeping items. You have been muted upon entry to avoid background noise and disruptions. If you are dialing in via phone only, please use *6 to take yourself off mute should you wish to ask us any questions. And we will hold off all the Q&A until the end. And feel free to use the chat box. You heard me a little bit earlier mentioning that during the presentation for questions and comments, and make sure that you select everyone from the drop-down menu. I will be moderating the chat box. And last but not least, this presentation is a contribution to the Innovation Learning Network, which means that you can live tweet throughout. The tweet handles of our presenters are available in the chat box. So with that, I'm going to hand this presentation over to Mohr to talk to us and introduce us to robotics in healthcare. Catherine?
Great, thank you very much. And I will turn it into an actual presentation. So is that showing well on the screen?
Yes, it is.
Okay. And let me know if there's any technical difficulties with it as we're going on. So thank you everybody for joining. And I work in surgical robots, but robots in healthcare are really so much more than just the single application of surgical robots. So I want to really talk about what really is a robot and how wide a net can we cast when we're thinking about what a robot in healthcare is. And if you look at the Oxford English Dictionary, I always like to go there when I'm thinking about definitions of things. Peculiarly enough, the Oxford English Dictionary has a very pop culture initial definition, where it talks about robots resembling human beings, able to replicate human movements and functions automatically, very much the way we think about science fiction kind of robots. Its secondary definition, which I think really is the better definition for the kinds of things that we're talking about today, is a machine capable of carrying out a complex series of actions automatically, especially one programmable by a computer. And it's this class of robots, not the humanoid science fiction ones, that we're going to be talking about today. And at its most fundamental level, a robot is a sensor or a set of sensors which are monitored by a decision-making function, which then makes some decision based on the changing state that it's measuring, which then leads to an actuator, some action on the world around it. And of course, there's feedback mechanisms associated with this. And when you boil it down to this most basic function, there are a lot of robots, and there are a lot of ways in which robots can be used in healthcare. So the first one, and this does get a little bit more to those kinds of humanoids, but you'll notice that neither of these actually are very human, but they do have very human-like eyes. And that's because these are companion robots. These are robots that are intended to interact with us on an emotional level. In the case of Autumn on the left, is a coach for weight loss, and Paro on the right is a companion robot as a pet. It's meant to respond well to touch, to help people who are lonely or disconnected or averbal to be able to care for something that doesn't actually suffer if they are incapable of caring for it or forget to feed it or anything like that. We also have robots in our house that we might not really think about as a robot. The modern washing machine has sensors. It is sensing all sorts of things about the wash cycle. It has multiple actuators for washing the clothes, and there is a decision-making process and a set of inputs. And you might not think about this as a healthcare robot, but in a lot of ways it really is, in cleaning and sanitization of garments, but also in terms of extension of independence. People being able to wash their clothes and have them dry and not have to do a lot of the physical labor associated with it means that people can stay independent in a house for a lot longer than they would be able to if they were having to do these sorts of things by hand. And so I actually characterize a lot of what we think of as sort of helpful devices around the house as also being part of healthcare, part of wellness care, and part of people being able to be independent and self-sufficient at home. The robot on the right of this, the PR2, is trying to fold socks. And this, or pair socks and be able to roll them up. And this is where a lot of modern robotics really falls down, is not in the structured task of washing the clothes that you see on the left, but in the unstructured task of needing to be able to use vision to identify the matching pair of socks, being able to take something that is floppy and you're not sure what the axis is and be able to match it up and then roll this up. It requires a lot more dexterity and vision processing than we've typically had. But we're at sort of a knee in the curve right now in terms of the capability of these robots working in unstructured tasks. We are also seeing a lot in the area of people bringing out home assistance type robots really aimed at these unstructured tasks, like loading the dishwasher, unloading the dishwasher in the form of the Boston Dynamics, and also a cooking robot that can cook in an unstructured environment, not a microwave where you pop something in, but that is picking up fresh ingredients and chopping it. Both of these are fairly far away from having them in your house on a day-to-day basis, but the amount of research that's going into them, thinking about how are we going to extend the capability of people being able to live independently for longer, there's a considerable amount of research going in that area. Another odd area of robotics that you might not think of immediately coming to mind as you think about robots are things like high throughput gene sequencers. These are taking samples, they're extending them, and then they're able to do automated gene sequencing using internal structures that are robotic, back to sensor, decision-making process, and actuator. And while we don't think about interacting directly with these robots, in healthcare, these robots are driving a lot of the innovations that we're seeing in things like personalized medicine, or being able to sequence entire genomes, such that we can use that data in order to do medicine better. And so these are really important aspects of a lot of what we think of as healthcare robots. There are also things like 3D printers. And again, we don't interact with the printer so much. It has the sensor, it's measuring as it is creating the object, and it has the actuator in the form of the device that is either fusing the metal or fusing the plastic in this case, or spinning a fiber in the case of a fiber winding machine. And again, while we don't interact with the device itself as a healthcare robot, we interact with the products that are coming out of this robot in the healthcare world, from being able to customize casts or tooth alignment devices or even prosthetics for patients, and also able to print in novel materials things like a titanium hip implant spacer. This is not the hip replacement itself. It's where a hip replacement has failed and there's a big bone defect, and you can use a titanium 3D printer to print a replacement for that bone defect, into which you can then put a hip replacement, a standard hip replacement. People are also building scaffolds onto which, or tissue scaffolds onto which you can start to grow replacement parts. And there are people walking around today who have blood vessels that were where the scaffold was 3D printed using electrospinning, and then it was seeded with their own intimal cells and their own muscular cells. And these grown blood vessels are now in patients today. And so we're seeing more and more being able to use the products of these robots for direct healthcare. Now, I work in surgical robots, and surgical robots certainly have sensors. There are sensors in joints, there are sensors at places where there's setups, at the brakes, at places where it's controlling what the motion of the outside arm is. But when you get to that definition of sensor computer decision-making function actuator, at the top level in surgical robotics, the decision-making function is human. And there's no autonomous surgical robotics in the soft tissue space. There's some semi-autonomous robotics in orthopedics at present, where you design the path it's going to take, and then it executes with the surgeon's hands off. But at present, for soft tissue robotics, all of this has an upper level human function in the middle of it. And so while we think about the robotic actuator as being classical robotics, and in some ways the robot that often comes to mind, it's the input of the human running the control input that those robots are exactly duplicating on the inside, so that you can repair a heart from the inside without having to crack open the sternum, but you still have a human in the loop. However, that controller itself is gravity balanced. It is sensing where the surgeon's hand is. It is making sure that there isn't too much weight against the hand. And it is moving in response to, actively moving in response to the way the surgeon's hand is moving. In addition, there are things like a robotic table that go along with the surgical robot that responds to the movement of the robot and coordinates the movement of the patient along with the robot. And so really what you can think of as these big surgical robots as being a collection of lots of smaller robots that are together and then are being controlled by a human at the top level. So they do kind of come back to being a robot. And I use that example because some of the other things that we think about in terms of powered exoskeletons, for an example, are exactly this kind of robot. They're the human making a decision about the direction in which they would like to walk. The robotic exoskeleton being able to sense the person's intent, whether, however that input is going, whether it's from torso muscles or from joysticks or from any other form of input, and then being able to execute on that in conjunction with the human. And so we would get rid of this entire class of robots if we weren't thinking about this form of wearable robot, where they're sensing the intent of the human and executing algorithms inside in order to be able to support the human's locomotion in this case, or in the case of wearable robots that are substituting for sensors or for hearing or for eyesight. You can take sound or vision and you can encode it into another form and be able to give vibration output to a person on their back to encode that signal in a way that they can then interpret it. These forms of sensory augmentation robots, again, still have a human at the top level in terms of a decision-making process, but that wearable is really wrapped around the person and is robotic. Now, we don't tend to think of wearables all by themselves as robots, but I want to use an example of starting to distribute robots through our lives, or making a distributed robot that supports us. In this case, if you've got a wearable that senses when you're waking up and can tell the cloud you usually want coffee this time, and the cloud knows that you usually want coffee when you're first waking up, it can then talk to your internet-enabled coffee maker and have coffee ready for you when you get out of the shower. This is a sensor, a decision-making process, and an actuator where all of these are no longer co-located. They're wrapped into your sort of morning routine, essentially. And at the extreme end of this, you could have a instrumented toilet, which on its own is only measuring things like metabolites and output. But if it's being monitored by algorithms that can then talk to a company that's delivering you more fruit and vegetables, or talking to your pharmacist and your doctor and adjusting your medications because of the outputs that are being measured by the toilet, you can now think about this as a larger robot wrapped around your entire life. It's got a sensor, it's got a decision-making process, and then the actions being taken are adjustments to your medication or adjustments to your food intake. And so when we think about this, and I deliberately cast a very broad net in terms of how we might think of healthcare robots, but we're seeing enormous changes happening in each one of these areas, from novel sensors to increasingly better AI and decision-making based on large amounts of data that we're being able to collect from multiple sources, being able to triangulate in towards health and be able to actuate and be able to make decisions based on this. And more things that are getting internet enabled that can be used as actuators in response to these decision-making functions. And so I see an enormous growth in terms of the ways in which people are going to be building robots for health and well-being. And I'm very excited to see this sort of stuff in the future. And fundamentally, when we're thinking about robotics in healthcare, we want to close a gap between what we want to be able to do for a patient and what we can do for a patient. And whether that's improving surgery or extending their independent life at home, or being able to more tightly control medications, the fundamental question we're asking in all of these is, what does it let us do that we couldn't do before? And I think the future of robotics in healthcare is incredibly bright, because there are still so many of those gaps that we want to close with this kind of technology. So with that, I will finish up, and I think you're going to do questions at the end. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was a fantastic overview. Really appreciate that. I especially love that question you posed at the end. What does it enable and allow us to do that we couldn't do before? Fantastic question. So, Catherine, when you're ready, if you would
yeah, I'm
sharing.
looking for how I hand it over. The little thing has stopped. Can someone just take it, or do I have to? Let's see.
Should be at the very bottom.
Yep, and it didn't. It's unpopped. So, all right.
Jenny, do you want to try and see if
you see if you can just take it. Somehow I've lost that interface. I'll just try quitting out of the PowerPoint. Did that do it? Ah, there we go.
We can.
It just, yeah, it just quit it out. Thank you.
Perfect. So Jenny, whenever you're ready.
All right. All right. Can you see my screen? My presentation? Yes. Oh, good. Yep. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm very excited to be able to share a robotic use case with all of you today to kind of make this a reality. This was a project that we started back in 2012 with the InTouch telemedicine robot in Northern California at our Fremont Kaiser Permanente hospital. So this picture here is one of my favorite pictures, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this picture. I love this picture because this is the day that we went live, and this is the first time that the robot woke up and presented itself in the clinic with the nurses around, and you can just see the curiosity and the smiles and everything. This photo really just captured the moment of that robot coming alive for the very first time. So one thing about this robot is it's actually a telepresence robot, which means it doesn't make decisions and do those types of things on their own. It's telepresence, so that means it needs somebody else who's coming in and who is taking the presence of that robot, kind of to allow you to be in two places at the same time. And so this is in our ICU, and in our ICU we have a small ICU. It only has 10 beds, and because it's a small ICU, it's not staffed 24 hours a day with an intensivist. So instead, what they do is the intensivists are there Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, approximately 5, and then once they go home for the day, then they're on call throughout the night, and then they come back the next day. So, so the use case for this robot was, instead of having no doctor there in the evening, what if we at least had an evening round happen, and then the doctor could potentially be available 24 hours through the robot, in addition to coming in person or over the phone if there did happen to be an emergency. So that was our use case: evening rounds, and then also emergent response. So emergent response is those emergencies that might happen at night. In this picture, you can see the robot is a little bit crooked, and I think because we were using it for the first time and we were figuring out how to make the head straight and the body straight and all of that. But it captured a really fabulous picture of the backside of the robot. So you can see a couple of things on the backside. You can see a handset like a little telephone handset. That is a privacy handset. So that allows the nurse and the doctor to have a private conversation. So that way the doctor isn't bellowing out the speaker if they want to say, if they want to say something on the more private side, they can have that conversation. And then there's a headset there. So the headset is for the nurse to put on, and then there's a stethoscope that's also there. And so the doctor can ask to hear heart and lung sounds of the patient, and the nurse can help with that. A lot of the doctors have said, wow, this stethoscope is so good, it sounds better than my stethoscope. I wish my stethoscope sounded that good. So, so we're really pleasantly happy with that response. Go on to the next slide here. When we looked at the robot, we also looked at other options. For example, you could potentially have a nurse pushing a cart with a camera on it and push that around. So what we found with the benefits of having actual mobility is that the physicians could come into the ICU anytime that they wanted, unannounced, and they could go and they could visit their patients. At 9 o'clock, they could come in and they could do their evening rounds, and they would have the freedom to talk to the patients, to talk to family members, and to talk to the nursing staff at the nursing staff station. So it gave them complete autonomy. It also has a really great zoom lens. And so to give you an example, a physician could stand in the doorway of the patient room and could zoom in and see pupil dilations of that patient. And some of our doctors even said, wow, I can actually see the pupils better through this camera than I could if I was there in person. So that it was pretty remarkable. And they also like the ability to have complete control of that camera rather than having to ask a nurse, oh, can you move the camera here or move it over there? So it was really good. So what worked well on this project? So one thing that worked really well with this project, I think, was hanging out with the nurses a couple of weeks before we went live. And so this was for the evening staff, of course. So if you can imagine, the evening nurses got there at 7 o'clock at night. When the nurses got there, the doctors were already gone. So the evening shift nurses didn't know those doctors very well because they weren't working there. And anytime that they ever did meet them, they were meeting them because they were calling them in the middle of the night for an emergency and they had to come in. So it wasn't always the most pleasant of encounters, waking them up and this and that. So they were a little afraid about evening rounds and what that was going to be like because they felt uncomfortable with the doctors. And they're also kind of uncomfortable about this new technology. But after hanging out with them for a while, they started to kind of, and socialize the idea and thought of it. They became up to it, and then it actually turned into excitement because they knew that we were testing this out, and their feedback was going to be critical on if we were actually going to keep this technology or if we were going to send it back. And our pilot was 90 days. And of course, we did a lot of the usual things. We're engaging our sponsors and stakeholders early on. We were meeting regularly. I also had a communication board for the staff. I think that was one thing that they really, really enjoyed. I tried to keep it fresh with metrics every week. We had satisfaction results that the nurses and the physicians were filling out after each time of using the robot, so they could see how they were doing with that. We also had what's called an idea book page. That's like a internal to Kaiser, like a wiki. And so I would update that. So we had people from all over Kaiser that were interested in the story of this, and so they were able to follow that. And then we also created a video just to kind of gain awareness and show people what the robot looked like and how it moved, and so that was a lot of fun too. Here's just a picture just to give you a sense of our communication board. Lots of pictures. I also encourage the nurses to take to take some pictures, like if they want to do a picture of the robot and put it up there, they could do that as well. So that was a lot of fun. We also had a lot of patients that were taking, not patients, but family members who would take pictures of the robot. The family members really loved it because they, when they would come in after work, which is typically around 7, 8, 9 o'clock at night, they never got to see the doctor. So now they knew that there was evening rounds and that they could actually see the doctor. So they would all come around the same time so that they could talk to the doctor. And sometimes they'd pose and take pictures with the doctor and with the robot. And so that was a lot of fun too. We also just did some awards. I created these little awards for the first team that used the robot for an after-hours emergency, and for the first team that used it, that actually used the stethoscope to listen to heart and lung sounds, just to try to make it fun. Here's a quote from our ICU nurse. It says, "Communication with a physician and nurse is a lot better. We have family members that even took pictures with the robot. It was really cool. They are really happy and excited seeing the robot." So what we found with this is, in the beginning, we were a little hesitant. We're like, what are people really going to think about this robot, going down the halls and, and the ICU? And what we found is that people were curious like we thought, but it was amazing to watch the interaction between the robot and the patient, or the robot and the family members, and the curiosity or the kind of the quirky look in their face would change very quickly to a natural conversation within a matter of minutes. It's almost like the technology just disappeared, and it didn't even matter anymore because they were there, they were talking to their physician, they were learning about their family member, and it wasn't anything more than that. So it was pretty amazing to see that happen. I'm going to show you guys another quote here from one of our hospitalists that are one of our night hospitalists. So our hospitalist said, "We have a 60 to 70% reduction in pages during the nights after starting the robot rounds. Since the night team nurses know their patients better and the respiratory therapists know their patients better, They know what to expect, so they are able to give us a clear idea of what the problem is, and the S-bar is perfect. So what was happening is the nurses would come in. So the night nurse, she comes in at 7 o'clock, and one of the first things she does is she checks the status of her patient and of her patients, and she goes around. As she's going around, in her mind, she's already thinking of little concerns. You know, this patient's going to have this issue. I'm a little concerned about this. She's having all these issues that comes to mind, things that she's concerned about. So in the past, she would just keep those in her mind. But now she knows at 9 o'clock at night, the doctor's going to come in, and she can share all those concerns with the doctor, and they can create a plan of action right then and there. And because of that, those reductions in pages were actually reductions in emergencies that were happening. So the amount of urgencies that happened at night just went down so much. We did have one situation where we did have an emergency that happened at night, and so the intensivist was called, and the intensivist, who normally would have taken about 20 minutes to come into the ICU, was actually able to telepresence into the ICU in like 3 minutes, and they were at the bedside. They were listening to heart and lung sounds on the stethoscope, and they were able to give orders and direction and get that patient where that patient needed to be much quicker than they could have if they had to take the time to drive down there. So we noticed that as well, happened a few times. So here's a quote from one of the ICU physicians. "The robot is directed by me and not somebody else. That allows me to go where I think it needs to be driven. This kind of immediate drive to where I think it needs to be is far more useful than having someone on the other end pushing and guessing what I want to see." So that's just another quote. Looking at the project findings that we had at least a 50% reduction in those after-hour pages. There was also a huge improvement in nurse, physician, and respiratory therapist communication. What we were finding is that in the evenings, as these nurses and doctors were doing these new evening rounds, sometimes the hospitalists would pop in because they were curious. At first, they were curious about the robot, but then they started finding value in listening to what the doctor was saying about the patient. So that way, if they did get a call from the nurses, they would already be familiar with the case of that patient. And then the respiratory therapists, they were joining too, of course, at first because they were curious about the robot. But then they started to find value in learning a little bit more and giving them an opportunity to ask questions about patients they might have been concerned about too. So it kind of ended up being this little mini interdisciplinary round that wasn't necessarily what it was set up to be in the beginning. Patients and family members were very, very satisfied. And we heard a lot of comments that family members just talking to each other in the room saying, wow, we are so proud to be here at Kaiser, that they're on the edge and they're able to do this technology in a great way, and it doesn't even feel like technology. It just feels so personal. And so it was great to kind of overhear some of those conversations, and sometimes they directed those at us too and thanked us. Here's some of the satisfaction results. One thing I was surprised about the satisfaction results is I expected them in the beginning to be kind of low and then gradually get better. And what we found is that from the very beginning, they were high, and they stayed high throughout the entire 90-day pilot. Things we looked at was, do you think that the robot advanced patient care? Was the audio useful, the mobility, the lens? As you can see, the doctors really loved the zoom lens. Nurses also felt it advanced patient care. The audio was useful, and of course, the mobility was useful too. This is just our project timeline. So we did the pilot for 90 days, and then we asked the company In Touch if we could have it for another 90 days, and they said okay. And then after that, they said, okay, you guys got to make a decision. You can't just keep extending this. You have to make a decision. So what actually ended up happening is we were kind of delayed in making that decision. And so when I was away at a conference in DC, they came to take the robot, and and the nurse manager and the nurses were calling me and the physicians were calling me. They're like, they're taking the robot. So that helped us to definitely realize and sent that message to leadership that we really need this, and there's so much value in it. And we were able to turn that contract around very quickly and then fully operationalize the robot. We also learned that technology is only as good as the support behind it, and this robot had excellent support from InTouch. And here's the new updated version of the robot, and this robot came at probably about right when we operationalized, the newer version came out, and I just wanted to share with you just a couple of things about this version of the robot. You'll see that the head is about the same size as a human head. You'll see a pretty normal height that the robot is. And another change that they made for this robot is they made it white. I forget exactly why they said that, but there's a humanizing impact of the color white versus the darker blue that it was before. And also, compared to the other blue robot, the shoulders are now rounded, so it has kind of that profile, more of a human profile. And people really did like this robot a lot better once it came out. And here's an article that was done, the Harvard Business Review did, of our robot, and you can see the robot walking down the hall with the nurse. So overall, I think it was a great picture. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can tell you about the robot. You guys are probably familiar with Roomba that can clean your house and vacuum your house. So with this newer version of the robot, you can see that there's the black band that goes around the lower part of the robot. That's the sensing eye that spins around to know where the robot is. And right below that, it says iRobot, which is the company that partnered with InTouch. So the bottom part is the same technology or very similar technology used in the Roomba vacuum cleaners. And so it's able to detect obstacles, and it maps itself, and it does all of these things. The nurses just wish that it could clean the floors at the same time when it was going around, but they didn't have that feature. And I think that's about it. And that's all I have. So any questions at the end of all the presentations, I'll be happy to answer.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Jenny. That was a fantastic overview, and thank you for sharing the use case and the outcome. There are a few questions that are in the chat box, so if you are
sure.
If you feel so inclined to go through and take a look, we can start the conversation in the chat log.
Okay.
And if you could stop sharing your screen, that we can hand things over to Charles, who is going to tell us about Catalia Health's work in robotics and their Mabu robot.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen and let me know if everyone can see it at this point. And if so, you can confirm. I'll go from there. Is everyone able to see the screen?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Good morning. My name is Charles Wu, and I'm the Director of Product Management over here at Catalia Health. I'm going to be talking about Mabu. What a great lead-in with the panelists, because it really highlighted a lot of the things that we're trying to do with robotics in healthcare. We talked a lot about the notion of a social robot. You saw earlier Autumn and Piro, which were social robotics really to aim and extend, the care of patients. And one of the things I think that's really important to think about is we've really talked about the definition of robots explicitly from the dictionary, implicitly through the use cases. And the way that we like to think about robotics is that they're sort of autonomous extensions that aid, assist, augment, and extend human activity. They're not replacements. They basically make us more powerful either by shifting things in time, be able to do things that we don't ourselves want to do. Similar to the Roomba, it really allows us to continuously clean our house without our engagement on its own. And these are the kinds of things that we're really looking at. So what we want to talk about is what are we trying to solve as a problem where we can extend our reach. And one of the things that we're talking about, and this was a great lead-in from Jenny, is with Kaiser, is we're right now investigating the power to extend the chronic heart failure use case. There's a central challenge to treatment with chronic heart failure. Right now, we're participating in a trial with Kaiser to figure out how can we collect more information and disseminate more information in both directions to help patients avoid readmittance after post-discharge for heart failure. Heart failure is an incredibly growing ailment in our healthcare system. A lot of people are unable to function. They're placed in the hospital. And after discharge, it is really crucial that we get adherence at the end of those first 3 weeks to 4 weeks to make sure that patients are able to manage their condition. And that challenge of adherence is in many ways. It's the traditional medicine adherence of taking the medication, but it's also the idea of monitoring your symptoms and that adherence, either been treating and watching your shortness of breath or even monitoring your weight, which is an early indicator of issues with your treatment plan. And here we have some quotes that come in through the heart failure area where we can see that there is a lot of challenge. Patients who do not adhere to the prescribed medication regimen were 2 times as likely to be admitted to the hospital. You know, medication adherence, again, is being reinforced, and the notion of how do you educate for self-care. And one of the big challenges that we have during post-discharge is that there's a lot of information being delivered at a time when people are very anxious. They're very unable to comprehend all the material that they're looking for. So what can we do to help aid that problem? And the question that we have is that Mabu was able to extend the healthcare team to the patient and the patient's premises. The current state of treatment post-discharge is to use call centers and nurses and nursing aides to try to connect with patients with phone to improve adherence. This is what we do now. We go and we say, you're discharged from the hospital and you're sent home. And a few days later, what you'll do is you'll try to get a phone call from your nurse's aide or from the call center, just checking in on your current status to make sure are you following your treatment program? Do you understand your treatment program? Are you able to have any questions that you're getting answered? And these are things that are really actually very difficult to do. Trends in communications have made this less effective. When phone calls were really effective with call centers, you had a high success rate for being able to connect with a patient. When they were at home and they were not as mobile, you were able to do that. But with the rise of how many people are being communicated and the success rate for calls, especially for calls that people don't know where they're coming from, we needed a better solution to be able to extend the reach of the care team, not only through the phone, but onto their premises at home. So we have a new approach with Catalia Health. What we have created is a robot, which is Mabu. It is a personal healthcare companion that keeps people engaged. And we've earlier mentioned about the power of what's going on with the eyes. Cynthia mentioned, Catherine had mentioned about how the eyes are really engagement. What we've noticed is that when you talk about engagement, a disembodied tablet like what Mabu has is not enough because patients are unable to look at it. They're also looking at it if you're on your handset, and there's a lot of other notifications. Also, the text is very small. It doesn't have a high engagement. When you bring behaviors with the eyes and the motions and you're talking to Mabu, which also has speech recognition, you get a higher engagement. And this is what we found with Dr. Corey Kidd, our CEO, that in his studies at MIT, that in a randomized clinical trial, patients were more engaged than they were for using a computer or a tablet or paper alone. By having a robot in the home, sitting there and engaging in a social way, extending the social interaction, you had a higher engagement. And we can see that paper was the least effective. A computer tablet was normally more effective because you have the ability to bring more information. But having a robot is there that is speaking to you in the home, that is moving, that when you look at Mabu, it tracks your motions and it interacts with you. And you're able to see the answers. You're able to speak to it or interact in multi-modes through the touch interface that allows you to have a higher adherence. And what we saw was higher adherence both in the engagement and in the length of engagement. So ultimately, what is the problem that Mabu is trying to solve? It is trying to improve adherence by creating an extension and augmenting the existing healthcare system. One of the things that we're really looking to do is reduce readmission rate by making sure that patients are following the regimen. And for CHF, or congestive heart failure, what we're really tracking are 3 key indicators throughout the day. Maybe we'll sit and we'll alarm during the day and say, check in spontaneously and say, how are you doing? Can we do a check-in? Can we see, are you experiencing any changes in the shortness of breath level? This is a leading indicator so that the system can know what's going on as to do we need to adjust any medicine that's going on? Do we need to retitrate? Do we need to do anything else? The other thing that we look at is collecting weight measurements. We ask the patient to measure themselves on a regular basis, as close to possible every day in the same way, to see do we have a leading indicator of weight gain. And then we ultimately ask, are they taking their medications? And we're trying to get a nudge. And when they're not taking their medications, maybe we'll interact and ask why, try to understand. And as one of the things that we've been talking about is this is an extension of the healthcare system. This is going back to the care team. All this information is going into a portal where they're able to look at that and look at that record in the history to see what's going on and be able to adjust. So ultimately what we're trying to do is Mabu is a friendly robot that is really trying to bridge the gap that happens at post-discharge. By placing Mabu in the home, patients are able to interact on their schedule, not on the call center schedule. If they have a question, Mabu has education modules that you can ask and say, what does it mean to measure my weight? What does it mean when my breath changes when I'm lying down versus standing up and doing chores? And it's that continuous social engagement that leads to the participation. And what we're finding out is that through these social robotics, we augment the empathy, we augment the compassion and the system and the connection that you would normally do with a human caregiver that's present. And it augments and extends that network. And one of the things that's really critical that we have to understand is we really look at, again, is that robotics are the autonomous extensions of abilities that augment and extend that support of the care system. It is not a replacement. One of the big fears that we hear in robotics is we're going to replace people. But the decision function is still happening with the care team. It's still happening with the doctors, and they're collecting the information. What they are doing is providing that timeliness that we talked about, second shift, the ability to have some answers or some ability remotely to that access. So really what you see is in all these robotic systems, what we're doing is we're creating a set of tools in an autonomous manner that extends the capabilities. We're able to therefore build a relationship on a continuous basis, where we cannot have the call centers and the doctors and the nurses calling every day. So they're able to have some sort of check-in that's able to be. We have repeated engagement, which is able to get reporting on a regular basis. And ultimately, what you want to do is have that connection where they feel that they're always connected and can provide that information, ask that information. We're able to look at the questions that they're asking in the system to understand, are you getting comprehension? And this promotes adherence. This also promotes the sense that people are concerned and observing, and it reports that key information, not only at the individual patient level, but at the population level as well. So what we really look at is that Mabu is a social robotic system that extends the care management system. And with that, I know that I'm happy to answer any questions following this.
Great, thank you so much for the overview of Mabu. We are very excited to see Mabu coming back to us. We featured, Corey actually gave a talk to the ILN community about 2 years ago and demonstrated Mabu as part of that talk. So it's exciting to see, to have you back. So we do have some questions that have come in through the chat box. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pose them to our panelists. So Charles, I'm going to start with you since you just gave us, you just finished the talk. So the question is coming from Mike Doherty. He's asking, does Mabu integrate with EMR patient portals or is it proprietary? Can you speak a little bit about that?
I think one of the challenges is the answer is yes. We have the ability to provide a direct portal, but we also have to participate in the larger system. And I think that's one of the things that we really identified through the history that Dr. Kidd has seen is that there is no isolation in healthcare. It is a bunch of partners working together. And what we do is we're looking at the different interfaces. And because there are so many different care systems, you can't really say, can you integrate with an EMR? Really the question is, can you integrate with a specific EMR? And that is actually set up because our data goes in the cloud. We have integration points that put us into that for the right care system. Great,
thank you so much for that. So the next question I have here is for Catherine. So Catherine, you gave us a great overview about the opportunities that robots bring to healthcare. And one of the questions that we got is, what's the most pressing need where robots can fulfill in the healthcare setting? So I think helping us think about, what are some of the immediate opportunities that may be addressed?
Well, if you look at the just morbidity and mortality, and I tend to look at it not in the medically treated, but in the surgically treated area. One of the biggest death tolls that we have is from lung cancer. And we tend to diagnose it very late. When we diagnose it late, we really don't have much in the way of treatment, and 15% of people worldwide live to see a 5-year anniversary after they've been diagnosed with lung cancer. And so that's the sort of thing that I will do when we're looking for what are the problems that need to be solved. And so we approached that from the point of view of, that's a diagnosis, not a surgical problem. If we can move diagnosis earlier, we can save lives. So even though we make surgical robots, we're like, it's time to make some diagnosis technology. And that, so from the surgical point of view, or what I would call acute care, that, just the death toll and that gap between what we want to be able to do and what we can is where we go looking for applications. But we have an epidemic of opioid use and deaths from opioid overdose right now. If we're looking for a public health crisis and something that we would want to do, what kind of technology could we bring to bear in that area? Different ways in which we could address that would be, we might be able to make a better pain management through some kind of technology. We might be able to do something along the lines of Mabu, where it's more emotional support and, so for that side of addiction or addiction management. Or we might be able to put up into the cloud a monitoring system that allows us to really look at where people's opioid consumption is getting out of whack because our electronic health records are somewhat disjointed and not connected. So there's lots of different ways in which you could attack these kinds of major public health issues that bring technology to bear in smarter ways, and they're not all one aspect of it. So that's what I mean when I say look for the gaps. Look for where there's more morbidity, more mortality, more misery, and say, are there ways in which we can do better?
Great, thank you so much. And I have one last question for Jenny. So Jenny, this question came from Marina. She's asking, it's a 2 or 3 part question. So the robot, the InTouch robot, does it play back encounters with MDs for RNs to view? And the follow-up question to that, with the information that is, the video consult portion of the encounter, does it become part of the patient's medical record?
Yeah, so the video is not recorded, so there's no recording. And the physician after the encounter will make a note in the encounter that this encounter was done by telepresence, but there's no recording of the encounter.
Great. Thank you so much. So we are coming up at the top of the hour. So I want to take a moment just thank our amazing panel this morning. So Catherine, Jenny, and Charles, thank you so much for spending your morning with us on this beautiful Tuesday. And with that, I'm going to hand things back to Cynthia to wrap us up.
Great. Thank you, Gloria. And thank you again to our panelists for joining us. Just a reminder that today's session was recorded and will be available on our member site later today. So please check out members.iln.org. Also want to make you aware of our next couple of sessions on Thursday morning We will be joined by our friend Helen Bevan from NHS UK, Leading Large-Scale Change, a Practical Guide. Please note that this Virtual Thursday will start at 9:30 a.m. versus our regular 9 a.m. So again, more details can be found on our member site. And on January 25th, we will be joined by our friends from Carolina's healthcare system, Proactive Health, where human-centered design and business model innovation meet. Thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful Tuesday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good day.